And Leah Ward is the Director of Campaigns at Metric Strategies. And before that, she was the Director of Communications for Alberta's NDP caucus up until just recently. And of course, you know Jason Markusoff of Maclean's. He's been away for a bit, but he's back. Good to see you, Jason. Leah and Talisha, welcome to the panel. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into it with the housekeeping out of the way. And Jason, you can kick us off. This Grassy Mountain decision, how does it reflect on the UCP government's coal mining policy?
Well, they've been a lonely voice of support for this very controversial industry for I guess, more than a year now, going back to when Kenny was championing coal as Rachel Notley's government was phasing out coal mining for some of Alberta's coal plants. So this is a long time coming. This is actually a loss that the UCP isn't really able to push back on. This was its own regulator in conjunction with the federal energy regulator on such projects. And in a statement, they agreed that, look, this says the review said that it's going to, not in the public interest, it's going to harm surface water fish habitats. It's also going to harm grasslands, First Nations heritage, physically and culturally. They had no choice but to take the loss on this one. What it means for other things, look, this is like they consistently wind up having to step back on their coal policies in terms of their broader repealing of the 1976 Lougheed era coal policy. So they, if there's a one point at which they start throwing in the towel entirely on a project that wasn't going to do much for economic development of this province and was going to tick off an amazing array of people, this could be the death knell.
Leah, the shift to open up more mining in the Rockies, as Jason alludes to, it's been a losing policy no matter how you slice it in terms of raw politics. So if Grassy Mountain can't get through, do you see the government tucking tail and backing away from this idea?
I mean, when the government reinstated the coal policy, they made it clear that their intention was still to expand coal mining in the eastern slopes, and the engagement that they undertook was on sort of questions about how to do that with the support of Albertans. Now that engagement is a whole other topic. I don't think many people believed it to be sincere or reflective of people's actual opinions. But I do think the UCP is pretty intent on moving forward with plans to develop in the eastern slopes.
For the record, the government says it respects the Joint Review Panel's recommendations, saying this is how the process is supposed to work, which is what you would expect from the government. But a statement from the Energy and Environment Ministers goes on to say, and I'll put the quote up on the screen so you can read along, despite falsehoods being perpetuated by some whose intent is to stoke fear and confusion on this matter, our government has not made changes to water protection legislation or water allocations in southern Alberta. So Talisha, it sounds defiant. What would you advise this government to do going forward on the coal file, especially given a lot of the backlash has been in rural Alberta, which is supposed to be the UCP heartland here?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, I think this is why we have independent review bodies, and this is why these decisions are made by these bodies rather than politicians. But the UCP, I think we've seen that both on the rural side and urban, that this policy is receiving significant pushback. The government is clearly still wanting to move forward, but it's important to also recognize that under the NDP, there were 4 coal projects that were approved that were approved under them. So this isn't just a UCP policy. Ultimately, I think the support for Albertans affected by this, they've put in supports to help those. And I think that they are messaging this in a way that's going to ultimately probably create some problems for them. But I do think that the government is focusing on moving towards projects in clean technology like we're seeing in Northern Alberta. And I think they're trying to kind of position this in a way to have both, right, where they can continue to develop, but also, move our province in towards clean tech and innovation.
Okay, I want to move on. And speaking of defiance, Jason Kenney came under criticism this week for denying that he had supported a ban on niqabs, even though he instituted a ban during citizenship ceremonies when he was Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. And this, of course, comes in the wake of the mass killing of a Muslim family in Ontario and on the heels of other Conservative politicians in Alberta apologizing for their party's contributions to Islamophobia in Canada, including Tim Uppal, who was the spokesperson for the niqab ban when he was in the Harper government. What do you make of Kenney's denial, Jason?
When I go back and listen to the tape, it seems apparent that he was suggesting that he was denying that he ever proposed a wide-ranging niqab ban like they have had instituted in places like France and various other countries. And in doing so, and in being tone deaf to the reaction to it, he showed that he's actually not paying attention to the discourse and the conversation that's going on. As much as he likes to think he stays abreast of these things and not, it was clear that everybody has been talking and asking about the niqab ban on citizenship ceremonies, and he tried to take it in this other very cute policy. And later yesterday in question period, and trying to defend himself further on this, he actually doubled down and said he continues to support the policy he had on a niqab ban for citizenship ceremonies, which several of his former colleagues are stepping back on. He just likes to be, he just almost enjoys being defined and enjoys almost is soaking in contempt and frustration now. And I'm not sure who's clapping at this other than his most ardent partisans.
Well, that leads to the next question. Jason Kenney obviously created similar controversy recently when he took issue with the idea of renaming schools just days after the discovery of those remains at the residential school site in Kamloops, BC. And a lot of people said, yeah, again, tone deaf, talk about timing. Leah, Jason Kenney is supposed to be a smart, strategic thinker. Is there a strategy at play here in terms of signaling to the base people who would agree to him? Or, as Jason alluded to off the top, is he really just not paying attention and he just never wants to admit he's wrong?
Well, you can only suspect that this is a deliberate attempt to reach a base that he's been losing support from lately. We know that there's widespread dissatisfaction in Alberta with his leadership and factions within his own party. So you can only assume that. I will say though that it's a pretty striking and hurtful approach to blatantly deny things that people can see and hear themselves. And so I think it might be time to stop characterizing Jason Kenney as a brilliant political strategist, because these are not in any way smart moves.
Delisha, what do you think?
So I think, first of all, it's important that we acknowledge that any form of hate or any form of action that makes people feel unwelcome is unacceptable in our country. And I think that all politicians across any stripe should be putting forward policies that ensure that people feel welcome in our country going forward. For this issue, I think it's important to acknowledge that under Premier Kenney, more Canadians have been welcomed to our country across the world. Ultimately, I think he has done more for welcoming Canadians. He has been highly lauded as the reason why the Conservative Party won the 2011 election, won their majority, was because of his work to outreach to new Canadians and growing the Conservative base. Ultimately, I think on his strategy that's been going on right now, I think even those within the UCP have seen that this is not a working policy right now or a working strategic tactic. Ultimately, I think we need to, as political messengers, need to skate where the puck is going. And if you're ultimately going to apologize for something, you should probably do it right away.
Are you saying he should have? In this case, do you think he should have just owned it and moved on rather than create days of headlines?
So I think on this issue, we don't know where he's going to go on this one. I think ultimately we need to acknowledge what is happening in our country and the problems that are arising that are informing hate. And I think that we should be doing more to welcome people in our communities and to our country.
I think we do know where he stands. He made it clear yesterday that he actually supports his original position.
All right, let's talk about a win for the Premier. All too rare these days, I think folks in the UCP would certainly argue. Kenney scoring a political victory today over the Western Standard. which issued an apology, a public apology to the Premier, and also issued a full retraction of that story it ran, claiming Kenney and several ministers were having private dinners at a restaurant against health restrictions. Kenney had been threatening to sue. Jason, given the unrest he's been facing in his caucus, how important is it for Kenney that the story isn't lingering out there?
Not only is it good that this story has been retracted and disavowed by the author of it, this is also a broader victory for Jason Kenney. Derek Fildebrandt, the former Wildrose MLA, who's crossed swords several times with Jason Kenney, was basically turfed from caucus by under Jason Kenney, has been a real right-wing, jab at him, constantly trying to shiv him through various leaks and scoops and stuff in his this Western Standard outlet. This was its biggest apparent alleged scoop, and now it was totally debunked and retracted. This cast doubt upon pretty much anything this fledgling outlet does, and Jason Kenney would love people to automatically doubt anything the Western Standard does right now. So quite a big win for him.
Leah, when the story broke, your old boss, Rachel Notley, essentially said it didn't matter if the details were true. She didn't know. She couldn't say one way or the other. But the point was that Albertans would believe the story because they don't trust Jason Kenney. Do you think this development will go a ways to change that?
Well, one of the hardest things about advising Rachel Notley, she's often smarter than most people in the room. And on this one, I think she's right. And I think the damage done here is just the notion that it might have happened, and the fact that Kenney remains profoundly untrustworthy. So we may be able to consider it a win for him that the story was retracted, but the trust has been broken, and the sentiment is out.
Okay, Talisha, you get the final word on this one. I mean, it won't get the same attention as the initial sensational accusations got, obviously, but how can he leverage this, Jason Kenney?
So I think it's first of all important to recognize that it's important that all journalists follow journalistic standards, and this was clearly not done in this case. I think with the history of doubling down over the last little bit, I can see why there was, questions about whether or not this story was true or not. Ultimately, I think that the government has a great way to use this story to say to build trust again with Albertans and show that what is being said is what they're following through on. Ultimately, I think Derek Fildebrandt is going to continue and will do whatever he can do to really, push on the government and, continue to erode trust in them. But ultimately, okay. I think this was a win for Kenney today.
And I think we'll set aside the debate about whether or not what the Western Standard does is an example of journalism for another day. But in the meantime, I got to say, I really enjoyed hearing your new voices, and yours too, Jason Markusoff. Leah, Talisha, Jason, thanks for this. Coming up next.
Thank you.
It's a story people rarely hear about, mostly because victims don't often take legal action. But now, an Alberta couple is speaking out after police mistook their home for a meth lab and broke down their front door. Back in a bit.